thing.
Wait for it to hit 5.
To start. Oh, it's supposed to start at 2. We're just losing all our time.
Is the microphone on? The mic must be on, right?
Sure.
Wait
Go,
for them
Penny,
to
go. They'll never stop.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, is the mic on? Can you hear me?
Is the mic on?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon session. Hello.
Stop enjoying yourselves so much.
Thanks. Bulawanak, everyone. My name is Peni. I'm from Fiji, and this is my colleague Yeshe. Welcome to our session. First off, I'd like to say I really love the way you've all been, especially in New Zealand. We're both visitors. And what I really loved hearing over the last day and this morning has been the way that you introduce yourselves in Te Reo. Unfortunately, I don't know it, so I won't do it this morning. But I will say, Naivango Peni Tawake, mai viti, ngani kandavu, wastalai kandavu. Vinaka. So, Yeshe and I this afternoon will be talking about partnership brokering. And by way of introduction, I'm Peni. I also have to say my age. Unfortunately, over the last day or so, people think I'm young and that I'm just starting in my career as a development practitioner. I'm 47, and I've worked for 15 years in the development sector in Fiji and the Pacific.
He's got a grey hair in his eyebrow, and he wants the respect that he's due.
We're also the same age, so. So Yeshe and I have known each other for about 10 years. We're both accredited brokers with the Partnership Brokers Association. Yeshe is also an accredited trainer. Now, as someone who's worked in development in Fiji and in the Pacific, specifically in Solomon's, Vanuatu, Samoa, and Tonga, I've found that the partnership brokering approach has really helped to level the playing field. For those of you who are from the Pacific and those of you who've worked in and with the Pacific, you'll know that quite often you have donors, managing contractors, development partners, and then you have the countries that you work with or the local partners. And often there's a real power imbalance. I've sat on the recipient or the donee side of the table, and it feels quite frustrating sometimes when you don't have a framework or a methodology that helps you have a frank and robust conversation that looks at building mutually equitable and accountable partnerships. So for me, as a development practitioner, I found that partnership brokering has been one of the ways to really build this equity. So I've got about 15 years of development experience with international and regional organizations and with development programs. And I think in the frame of having robust conversations, as a Pacific Islander, as a Fijian, I've seen and experienced enough racism in the development sector in the last 10 years that I thought it's time that, and my collective experiences over time have really led me to work with Yeshe on this work around locally led development and decolonisation. I'd like to say that there are some visible forms of racism that we see in development. Some of those are things like pay gaps, benefits, the opportunities, professional development, even the ability of, for example, white staff in development programs who may fail, for example, be able to move on to another managing contractor. If a local staff member messes up, you're done. And I've seen this happen, with my own eyes, with people in my country. Yeah? So those are some of the visible things that you see in the way that racism plays out in development. Some of the more invisible things are the ways, for example, that writing is valued. So for example, local staff who work in development programs have that deep, rich, contextual knowledge of the context, an understanding of the political economy, where power lies, how it's used. But that's often not valued. What donors value is the way the write-up is done about the local political economy. And that's something that, that we really suffer from in the region is we've grown up in education systems that are essentially colonized, that teach you how to behave, but don't teach you these critical analytical skills. And that's something a lot of us have to work to learn either at the tertiary level or in our work experience. So the work that Yeshe and I have been doing around locally led development has been a realization that we can have systems and policies and procedures in place, but one of the things we also have to shift is the way people think. And so we'll cover that a little later in the second session. But what I really wanted to say is partnership brokering has been useful for being both a framework, but also helping to shift the way that we think as Pacific Islanders as well, in the way we engage in development. Yeshe.
Yes, I'll just introduce myself. It's lovely to be with you. As Peni said, my name's Yeshe. I'm a walking poster girl for cultural appropriation because my name's from Tibet. My parents were living in a commune, a Buddhist commune outside of Christchurch with a Tibetan monk when I was born. It was the 70s, and that's what people were doing. But the commune moved to the Arctic Circle in Canada, and then my mother realised that monogamy was a requirement for her and wasn't in the commune, so we moved back to Australia. I was brought up in Australia on unceded Worimi land, and I live now in Melbourne on unceded Wurundjeri land. And my heritage is Greek, Irish, and English, all migrants and settlers back to my great-grandparents, very mobile. Partnership brokering, yeah. So Peni and I are both accredited brokers with the Partnership Brokers Association. We're an international organisation with a dispersed leadership model around the world. And the materials which we're going to share with you today mostly originated in West Africa, looking at resource extraction and all that corporate social responsibility money, and looking at why some of the partnerships built around that CSR money were productive and useful, and some were destructive, if not, inefficient or completely ineffective. So that's where this material came from, but it's been developed over the last 30 years and it's now used. We train and work with people with these materials all over the world, in every sector, on partnership, all kinds of partnerships. I've worked in international development for about 20 years. I was with AusAid and DFAT for 11. I've lived and worked long-term in Papua New Guinea and Fiji and Ghana. And now I work independently. About half of my portfolio is partnership work in Australia and half is still international. I think that's all. The only other thing I wanted to say was that I came to this model at a time when I was feeling so ethically compromised by working in international development that I was feeling like potentially I would have to leave the industry. And this model gave me a way to work so I felt like I could work ethically no matter what space I was in international development. So it's been hugely impactful for me in terms of professional practice. Peni and I do a lot of work on decolonisation, and we're hoping you'll come to our session later on, which will be very specifically on working in multiracial teams. But what we are going to do today is put a particular focus on multiracial teams and addressing race explicitly in partnership spaces. And that's what we hope we'll have discussion about at the end. So we're going to talk broadly about partnership practice and try and hone in on that element of multiracial partnerships, because that's the spaces that we work in the Pacific.
Thanks, Yeshe. And in case it's not been abundantly clear, Yeshe and I are practitioners, we're not academics, so we won't be engaging in an academic discourse this afternoon. So as we mentioned earlier, partnerships, using the partnership brokering approach has really helped, the partnerships I've brokered and Yeshe's brokered, to really build towards mutually equitable and accountable partnerships. But what can also be problematic about the term is it's used quite broadly. So anyone who's worked with the SDGs will know that UN agencies and the partnerships with the local and regional organizations and with countries will talk about national partnerships. Development donor partners will also say the same thing about we have a partnership with this country. Australia has a Vuvale partnership with Fiji, for example. And while they're critical to solving complex issues, the infrastructure, the architecture of those partnerships isn't necessarily mutually accountable or equitable. Sorry, am I pressed? Oh, it's the wrong way around. Okay, so the term can be used to disguise business as usual. So what it really does is it's an ongoing replication of existing power dynamics in business processes. So you'll see, for example, in some contracts, which are sometimes called partnership documents, that the risk for the most part is borne by the donee country or the donee partner. So it provides a veneer of collaboration and good intent, but it makes it really hard, it's so much harder for the formerly colonized to call out poor development practice from former colonizers. So as I said, some of those things in a contract will say that the donee is accountable to the donor, the donee carries all the risks. And one thing when we're reflecting on development partners in the Pacific, particularly for Australia and New Zealand, who do quite a bit of development work in the region, sometimes there's a sense that we're a family. And we all know that when you're a family, it's very hard to ask questions, tough questions. How will that impact on the relationship? When you're talking about the development sector, will that impact on funding, on support, on the engagement? If we work in a particular sector in agriculture, will that also have an impact broadly on other sectors as well? So I wanted to leave that question with us this afternoon to say, what does this mean for the way that New Zealand is positioned in the Pacific?
I find this fascinating. Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility is my personal Bible. And, she says that the most dangerous person for the person of colour is the left-leaning liberal. Because when you're positioned as I'm an earnest, trying my best ally, it's much harder to face that person and say, actually, you're part of the problem. So I'm curious about, as an Australian, I love being here and seeing what you're doing because you're so far ahead of what we're doing in Australia. It's ridiculous. There's no teacher of development studies who's going to be declaring their positionality at the start of a session at a conference in Australia. But I think there's a peril in it as well, in that you are positioned so heavily as a friend, as family. And I just think it's good to question, what does that mean does that make it harder for Pacific colleagues to challenge you than it does to challenge an Australian? It's so much easier to say to an Australian, I don't appreciate what you're doing. Yeah, so that's just something for you to think about. So we're just going to go through the basic materials. Usually Peni and I run this as a discussion, and we like people to stop and ask questions as we're going through. But because we've only got a very short time and there's people online, we're going to power through the material and then do questions at the end. It's not our preference, but I think that's the way we have to go. So, really basically, what does the P word mean? I was at La Trobe University. I did a check. I was a professional staff member. There were 52 people with the word partnership in their job title at the university. What is it? What is it in the zeitgeist that makes us feel better about ourselves if we use the P word? There's something. In Australia, everything is called a partnership. The government has a private sector arrangement with a private company to build a for-profit road. It's called a partnership. The word is used horribly, usually as some kind of soft, comfy blanket to make people feel better about what is just doing business the same way they always have. We start with this really basic definition, an ongoing working relationship where risks and benefits are shared. Does that sound easy? Sharing benefits equitably is hard enough. Sharing risk in a genuine way, deeply difficult. So that sounds easy, it's not easy. These are some of the elements that we would look for in a relationship that we would define as a partnership. Common purpose, that sounds simple, but for a lot of us in the Pacific, we're signing up on work where the purpose has already been determined and designed by somebody else. Yeah? So establishing common purpose, rare. Shared and individual interests, and this is fundamentally important. Shared interests are usually the noble goal. You're working on a program in Papua New Guinea to address women's and children's health. Every partner can sign up with their hand on their heart and say, yeah, of course, that's why I'm here. That's what I'm doing. But underneath that, the Provincial Ministry of Health's coming up, the governor's coming up for election and has been being heavily criticised on health statistics and wants to get runs on the board politically. The donor's trying to get on a World Health Organisation, panel, and they also need to address the fact that their Australia and PNG's got the worst maternal health, statistics in the world. Do you see what I'm getting at? Every person involved in that partnership has individual drivers and individual interests, which we don't acknowledge. We don't discuss them, we don't write them down, we don't navigate them, they just bubble along underneath, motivating the way we participate in a partnership, but hidden and quiet. So in partnerships that Peni and I work on, we very explicitly say you need to understand each other's individual interests. And it's not dirty or somehow corrupt. It's we need to know those so we know why you're behaving the way you are and how we can help each other maximise the benefit of the partnership. But in almost all collaborations and partnerships, they only talk about the shared goal, the noble goal. Co-creation, I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but co-design is the bane of our existence in Australia. Is that the same here? Every government department wants you to co-design, but what they mean by that is, here's our co-design guidelines, you will design it like this. Co-creation, it's the same. I mean, even in a program where someone else has already designed the purpose, if you take the time to work carefully on a partnership, you can do some co-creation. But we often don't take the time to do that work. Sharing risks and benefits, as I've said, when we work contractually, with a contract as the governing document of our relationship, the risk is all assigned to one party. Got to work out ways to share risk if it's a partnership. Mutual accountability. This, when I was at AusAid in the kind of late thousands, early teens, this was, the standard language, very fashionable. But what mutual accountability meant was, I will give you more money if you jump through more hoops. So when I was running a program out of Fiji, a regional program that Peni later worked on, we worked out ways to make ourselves accountable as a donor to our partners for our partnering behaviour. So I asked them to give me metrics for the partnering behaviour they wanted from me, and every quarter I sat down with them and said, how am I going against these partnering metrics? My colleagues hated it. They didn't want me to establish that standard of behaviour because they didn't want to be held to that. But I was funding people who said they'd been receiving Australian funding for 20 years and had never had the funder make themselves accountable. So, and none of that's written down, it's not in the contracts, it's not being assessed, but it's part of a structured partnership approach, is thinking about what does mutual accountability mean. And the last one there is a principled approach to working together. Peni and I are allergic to fluffy motherhood statements at the start of documents that say, we will work with a respect-based relationship, we will establish trust and blah, 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 blah. Because it doesn't mean anything, right? They're just nice motherhood statements. These principles in a structured partnership are used, again, as an accountability measure. So if we have a principle, we have behaviours underneath it. Whenever someone says to me, we need a respect-based relationship, I say, tell me what that looks like. Tell me what the other partners do that makes you feel respected. Then we write that down, and then we hold each other accountable to those behaviours. So if one person working at an NGO has a problem with someone working at a high commission, if you don't have those principles written down, it's just you, the person Mary at the NGO, going to make a criticism about John who works at the High Commission. It's an incredible personal risk. If you have those principles written down and negotiated carefully, you can point to them, go to John's boss and say, we agreed that we would work in this way. Here are the examples of the way that John is not sticking to these arrangements. So when we say a principled approach, we're talking about practical behaviours that can be used as a form of accountability within the delivery of a partnership. That have to be carefully negotiated. We like to say navigated, not negotiated, at the start of a partnership. This slide's pretty foundational for us. All collaborative or all delivery relationships will fit somewhere along this slide. Really important to say, we're not saying left side bad, right side good. Absolutely not. This is again the problem with partnership. Because it's so fashionable and because it's value signalling, everything has to be a partnership. Please, no. The more you can do at the transactional end, the better. If you can just buy a whole heap of mosquito nets, deliver them and get out of there through a contract, then do it. It's nice and black and white, it's clear, it's simple. The further you get up here, the messier and more political it is. So I spent a lot of time pushing back with groups, actually. I had a fantastic example with a Commonwealth organisation when I was based in Fiji. And I was working through the whole same partnership frame with them that I was with 25 other partners. And they were more and more and more frustrated with me. And I'd ask them a question and there'd be this obvious resentment coming back and they never answered questions. And I think it was an introvert-extrovert problem more than anything else. But eventually I said, and this was an e-Kiribati woman, a very traditional older woman, and I said, if this partnership was working perfectly, what would happen? How would it work? And she said, I would write you a 5-year budget and a plan, and I wouldn't have to talk to you again for 5 years. Can you imagine how frustrated she was for a woman like that to say that to someone working for AusAid that was managing her funding? And I said, fantastic, we don't need a partnership. Let's have a transactional arrangement. Then Commonwealth Office in London said, absolutely not. We want to be in a partnership with AusAid. So we worked out a way then to agree that we were in a transactional relationship, and we created rules for a transactional relationship, and we agreed on language we would use to navigate to head office. But if we hadn't had this delineation to help us understand different forms of implementing relationship, that conversation would have been impossible. So I think this is a great thing, to talk to the people you're working with and say, where does our relationship fit along this spectrum? It's also really important to say you can have an overarching relationship that's up this end, and you can do pieces of work that hang from it that are down here. But again, you have to have talked that through. Everyone has to have the parameters shared and understood for all of that. When I get brought in on partnerships that are not working, which I often do, I'll put this up on a wall and I'll say to the 40 people in the room who've been working together for 4 years, where does your partnership fit along this spectrum? They'll be spread from one end of the room to the other if it's not working, looking at each other going, why are you standing up there? They've been working together for 4 years and they don't have any shared conception of the kind of implementing relationship they're having, for what purpose. So I find that continuum really useful. Our whole approach is premised on saying, make your partnership work intentional, make your relational work intentional. Most of our relational work is left to luck of particular people getting along in a particular way and to the personal and professional preferences of individuals. This is especially perilous for those of you who are subject to funding from high commissions, because people at high commissions turn over every 2 or 3 years. So you just have to wait until the new councillor comes in and hunker down and see how they want to work. And everyone is subject to that. It's accidental. It's not intentional. It's not designed. So we're advocating for rigour and discipline and process around relational work. We use a partnering cycle. It looks a lot like a project cycle. That's deliberate, because we're saying get as much structure and process around your relational work as you have around your project work, around your contracts. That looks lovely and linear. Of course it's not. You might get around to reviewing efficiency and value, realise that you're missing a key partner who should be in the room, and have to go back up to scoping. But it is useful to remind yourself, and again, to sit with your partnership group and say, where are we up to on this scale? When I train people, we have a 4-day foundational training on individual partnership brokering skills. People almost always come in and say, we start at 3 o'clock. You know, we get the funding and we have our first steering committee meeting. We haven't done any of that foundational work. And I still don't understand why this is the case. How do we sit down to work together on a $20 million program for 5 years and not have time to have a conversation about who we are, what we want to get out of this, what we fear, what our non-negotiables are, what our assumptions are about each other? How do we do it all the time? I think it's because Western professional environments strip out the personal, strip out the relational, and this feels like too soft and interpersonal. I think that's what it is, but it comes back to bite us on the bum all the time. Because misunderstanding, miscommunication, misalignment, how much time do we spend on that? Huge amount of time, because we haven't had the foundational conversations. Sorry, I'm going at the speed of light. We have 5 foundational principles that we look to embed in our partnership work, in every element of our partnership work. So I'll just go through those and then I'll hand over to Peni. The first one is anxiety about difference. Diversity is what brings us together into partnerships. We come together because we're different, because we can do things together that we can't do apart. That same diversity and difference causes us anxiety, because we're humans, We were monkeys not so long ago. And we like to be with people who think like us, talk like us, dance like us, dream like us. So that anxiety immediately causes, that difference causes anxiety. If you've got black and white people in a room, that's very obvious difference. The hardest difference I've ever had to work with is doctors and social workers in rural Victoria. Their professional backgrounds were so different, their technical frame was so different that getting them to agree on a path forward nearly killed me, harder than any black and white room I've ever been in. So there's many different forms of difference that cause this anxiety. What's the principle we're looking for there to address that? Embracing, challenging, protecting that diversity. What we'll typically see is the more powerful partners trying to iron out the diversity. So the World Bank will get into a relationship with an NGO in Cambodia, they want to build a road, and the NGO is politically connected and they're in the communities, and the World Bank gives them an 80-page monitoring and evaluation reporting format. And 2 of the staff members of that NGO spend 6 months a year filling in the monitoring and evaluation report. They're not out in the community being... Yeah, so the World Bank, I'm working with you because you're different, but I want you to look like me and behave like me, so please do this. So in the partnerships Peni and I are working on, we'll be looking for that all the time. How are you as a group protecting the diversity that brought you together in the first place? And I think it's a source of power for Pacific stakeholders to be able to say, you brought me in because you wanted this expertise. The thing you're imposing on me is making it impossible for me to do the thing that you want me to do. It's where these principles and this framework can be useful. Power imbalance, we're all very familiar with that. In my career, I've sat on, even at AusAid, when I was in the Pacific, I was the big guy. When I was in Bangladesh, I was the tiny guy. So most of us have to have experience and skills to either claw some power back or to share it. The power dynamic that Peni and I focus intensively on is racial. So we're doing a huge amount of work on racial power because we're both working in shared racial spaces in the Pacific where we find the racial dynamics very uncomfortable and unacceptable. But people will work on all different elements of power in their partnerships. Hidden agendas. I think a really good example of this is our program funded the Pacific Conference of Churches, and I wooed them for 6 months. I was working on a leadership program across the Pacific, and I thought, I can't work on a leadership program and not work with the church. I'll look like an idiot. At that time, the Pacific Conference of Churches had never taken funding from a non-faith-based donor, ever. It was a policy that they had. It took 6 months, but eventually we had a really frank conversation where they said, we don't agree with Australian policy on climate change and trade negotiations. PACER Plus was being negotiated at the time. So then we worked out a way to navigate through that so that, we had this very detailed thing where if they were going to put out a press release, they let me know 3 days beforehand. I went up to the High Commission and briefed the High Commissioner and, we could manage that. But if we hadn't gotten down to that hidden agendas discussion, either we would never have had the partnership or the partnership would have fallen over the first time they put out a press release about Australian government policy. It's really, really common that these are bubbling under the surface. We suspect them about each other, we assume them about each other, we don't air them, we don't discuss them, we don't manage them until they cause us problems. So openness and transparency are, again, fundamental to the approach. Difficult because openness and trust work like this. And they're very chicken and egg, right? You're not going to be open until you trust someone. You're not going to trust someone until they're open with you. A way that I often work with that is where there's a trust gap. I'm doing work in Indigenous Australia, working with White Australia at the moment. Massive 200 years trust gap. We have to talk openly about that trust gap, and we have to talk about trust-building measures. Because trust is also a pot of power that people sit with, the powerful. And you're just paddling. I've got to make them trust me. I don't know what I have to do. And I don't know when it's going to happen. So where a trust gap is identified, I ask people to say, tell this other gang what they need to do in the next 6 months to build that trust, and in 6 months' time we'll sit down and look at whether that's been done. So I hope you can see it's trying to make visible all the stuff that's usually invisible. These are all very difficult conversations. They're not conversations we normally have in a professional space. Competitiveness. So, you're in a partnership for 4 years, you haven't managed to work out a shared space of achievement, you're both still just trying to get what you want. It's deeply frustrating. So that mutual benefit has to be really carefully navigated. It's also an area where people assume. Donors very commonly assume that they know what the people that they're funding want to get out of it. And they're often wrong. We often don't actually, again, what do you want to get out of this relationship that we have? What do you want to get out of this program? Another one to really carefully work through. The last one here is uncertainty. Remember back to the spectrum. When you're working transactionally with a contract, it's very clear. It's very clear the way you're working, what people's roles are, what will happen if you don't do the work, how you're going to work. Working collaboratively, it's a massive, it's basically a big black hole of we don't know. How this is going to work, who are these people, what's going to happen if I don't meet my commitments, what am I committing myself to? It's a huge degree of uncertainty. So typically, people like us that get into partnership brokering, we love uncertainty. We thrive on it. But there's other people that would rather shoot themselves in the foot than work this way. So you have, and organisations as well. Some organisations can tolerate a high degree of uncertainty, and some just can't. What's our principle there? Courage. Again, this is the kind of principle that NGOs will talk about, NGOs, not usually in a donor space. But this kind of work requires bravery. Having those conversations about hidden agendas and power and structuring, the way that you're going to report to each other along different lines, that all requires some courage. The last thing I want to say about this is none of this matters, none of these principles matter if they're not embedded in daily business processes. These are not about statements you make in the front of a document. So I'll give you an example. I was working on a big sustainable livelihoods program for Afghanistan. We were all out in Dubai. There were 6 INGOs. There was DFAT Kabul and DFAT Canberra and a managing contractor. I cried in my room every night when I was brokering this. It nearly killed me. And the DFAT lead in Kabul said all the right things. He said, we can't get out of the green zone. We can never do monitoring and evaluation. We don't know anything about sustainable livelihoods. You 6 INGOs, you're the lead. This is your intellectual property. You're the experts. They were also forcing 6 INGOs who only had a history as competitors into a consortium. That's another one, donors forcing people into partnership. So all that rhetoric had been done. We'd done the principles and everything else. What I like to do then is work through hypotheticals of business process to test that. So the first thing I said was, tell me how annual planning is going to work. And the guy from DFAT Canberra said, well, every year each INGO will write an annual plan and submit it to us for approval. So I just left it there for a long time. And I said, does anyone see any, reflecting on what we discussed this morning, one of the guys, 3 Afghan ministries. So one of the guys from one of the Afghan ministries said, but they said they don't know, how are they going to judge if the annual plan? So then we spent 2 hours designing an annual planning process that fit with the principles. But do you see what I mean? The power imbalance is hidden in places like how the annual planning works, or who designs the monitoring and evaluation framework, or where meetings are held, or how you write your emails. So our paper that we'll be talking about in the latest session, it digs into all that. Where are the personal changes in practice that you can make to live these principles? But these principles and what they're meant to achieve are meaningless if they're not built into every element of your business process, how you work with each other as partners.
This last slide that relates to the process of developing those partnerships through the partnership brokering approach, I found has been really useful. I mean, I usually use this slide when I'm working with local partners in the Pacific to really try and bring out the value of non-financial contributions. Those of you who've worked with local organizations will know that quite often there's a sense of powerlessness when you're engaging with a donor. And what we usually say when we're sharing this slide with those local partners is say that, when you're looking at this slide, I'd like you to take money off the table. What are all the non-financial contributions that you bring? And quite often, they're things that the partner knows intrinsically but doesn't really feel there's a financial value to. They're things like the networks and connections they have, the champions who support the work that they do. In a church partnership in Fiji, each church that was part of that partnership had churches or warehouses out in the provinces that the partnership could use to store items and distribute them from. And even things like information around, what's the safest place within each community where you can go during a hurricane or a cyclone. And in one of the partnerships I worked with, the partners told me that there were 7 layers between them and DFAT. And so they felt quite powerless when they were having discussions around what will the future directions of the program be like. Once we'd taken them, once we'd spoken through the slide, what I tried to really reinforce with them was to say that you actually have a lot of this unacknowledged power. But what you need to do is to put it on the table when you're speaking with the donor to say, we don't come here with nothing. We actually have all these things. As a matter of fact, anyone can come with the money, but no one can work in our communities the way that we do. So I found that this has been really useful to help really shift, in a sense, to decolonize the way that we think about partnerships, particularly for local partners who work with communities, but one of the things they lack is funding to be able to make the work function. I guess just to close out this part of the presentation, Yeshe spoke about the program that we both worked on. So Yeshe was there for the beginning of the program. I worked for the last 6 years as we closed it out. We have, to this day, enduring relationships with the stakeholders and the people from those partnerships across those 4 countries because of the work we put in at the beginning to really build those equitable, mutually equitable and accountable partnerships. To this day, we can call on people in prominent places within the Solomon, Samoa, Vanuatu, and Tonga because of those enduring partnerships. What it also meant, though, was that there was a degree of accountability for the work I was doing on the ground. And I worked on partnerships in Samoa, and I think about 2 years out before the end of the program, we knew that the program would wrap up soon, and that's the nature of programming. But it also meant that I also had to be open to hearing from partners about their frustrations with the way that programs work. And I think that's also part of using the partnership approach, is recognizing that you've also got to take some of the heat that you expect partners to take from the partnership as well. All right, so what we wanted to close out this session with was just to leave these questions up for you to consider, in the partnerships that you're going to be, or that you're working on. So just to think through these, and then we'd be really happy to have some discussions around these. So the first question. Okay, we'll just let you read through these questions. Yeah.
These are, Peni and I put these together with some other colleagues because we've had to build a deep practice around explicitly addressing race in spaces where people are not comfortable to explicitly address race. So these are some of the questions that we ask ourselves when we're going into these processes, and we just thought we'll give them to you to think through, and then whether you want to talk about the earlier slides or these questions, whatever it is that you'd like to reflect on. So when I'm working with doctors and social workers in rural Victoria, none of these questions are going to come up. They're all white. This is not going to inform the brokering work. We'll be talking about all those principles, but in different elements. But when we're working in multicultural, multiracial spaces in the Pacific, we think these are fundamental to practice. Just to share with you, Peni and I did a session similar to what we're going to do after this at the Australian Council for International Development conference in Australia last year. And one of the large INGOs wanted us to have counsellors available afterwards. And I said no. And they said, we just think people might find these conversations really difficult. And they're talking about the white people. And I said, if you have staff who are working in international development who cannot have an uncomfortable conversation about race, they should not be working in international development. And if they don't want to come to this session, then don't come to this session. But there is no way we are providing counsellors. And what did you say?
I said, if they need counselling, imagine the decades of counselling we need for the grief that development programs and donors put us through. Yeah.
But this is why also I'm talking about how far ahead you are. I mean, in Australia, I just use the term white people, my Australian mates, and people stiffen up and get deeply, you have all these names for racial groupings in your country. We don't have that at all. We only have the white majority and other people who have race. So, anyway, over to you. Questions, thoughts, anything? Susa, the backside?
She's my neighbour, so she just called me out. I'm really grateful for the presentation that you guys have done. And I think because you've come from Australia, I'm from BNJ, so it'll be a good conversation. But I think a lot of what has come out from this presentation is really useful because I've been in that space before. And the thing that struck me was the power imbalances and the competitiveness and ensuring mutual benefit. So from a larger aid perspective, Papua New Guinea gets a lot of aid from Australia, and that ties back to colonial histories and that, but also other histories of being the closest neighbor and that. But apart from that, just from my own personal experience around power imbalance, and that ties into pay gap and knowledge gap. And I think you guys are in that space, and a lot of what people term as boomerang aid to Papua New Guinea, back in that. So I mean from your own experiences, you might give some context into that. But for me, what is your view as you guys get into that, and now that you're out of DFED? The view of pay gap and knowledge gap and the power imbalance that exists between contractors being flown into Papua New Guinea to manage and roll out larger aid funding that goes into Papua New Guinea, as well as contracting people. I've applied for a job and they label me as a national, and they come in as expert. And I ask them, I've been educated at Sydney University and Auckland University. What makes you an expert? And so those are the kind of uneasy questions that us, as people from the Pacific, need to ask. And that's when the uneasy conversation or the space that we're in becomes something that we will have that we can be comfortable to talk about. And that's when maybe we can do development differently. But I think this was one of the challenges of me as a Papua New Guinean, being in that as a development practitioner, being treated in that space, being told that you're a Papua New Guinean, you're a national, and I come in as an expert. And so anyway, I've been working and living here in New Zealand, but I still do work in the Pacific as well. And for the last donkey years that I've been here, I've always done work in Papua New Guinea and the region. And the rest of you who are here contributed a lot in your own capacity. But I think the question is, how do you address that the power imbalance of pay gap and knowledge gap? Because if you look at knowledge gap, a lot of local people have a lot more knowledge than you going in and claiming to be an expert. But the pay gap is that they probably get peanuts. They told me that I'm a national, I'll be paid in Papua New Guinea peanut and at this level, and we're a consultant who comes in, and I advise that person, and she gets probably 10 times more than me. And so that has been the reality, but I don't know how you address that when you talk to work around the region and in other places where you do have other people that have that, the competitiveness of being in that space.
Full disclosure first is that I got flown into Papua New Guinea in September, and I'm getting flown into Papua New Guinea again in January to do work, so I'm part of the problem that you're talking about. But I think, look, I did a huge piece of work a few years ago with a managing contractor, and for people in New Zealand, I mean, 30% of our aid program is delivered through managing contractors. In Australia, they're privately listed companies that run the programs for profit, but they are the main site where local staff and international advisors come together to work. So I did a huge piece of work, and I thought they were really brave. They hired myself and a Papua New Guinean woman to co-facilitate, to talk about the racial dynamics and racial relations within their team. I've never seen another organisation who works in PNG do that. But man, it got to a point of rage about these issues. I mean, it even became clear that they work on a compound down at the marina, and the Papua New Guinea, I'm going to say the black people who work in the organisation have to park outside the fence, and the white people park their cars inside the fence. So forget about, you know, they have different hospitals. So their health cover, they go to different hospitals. They don't access the same hospitals. The pay scales. For me, the only way that gets fixed is to not have white people in those roles. I think that's the only way. And those are much more effective programs as well. We have a colleague who is a team leader on a program in Fiji, and she's fantastic, and she says, I want access to those specialists, but I want them on the phone. I want them, if I want them to fly in, I want to be able to ask for them to fly in, but I can run this program. I don't need a white person running the program. But I don't think that can ever be resolved, especially in PNG with security issues and everything else. The only way is just don't have white people in those leadership roles, I think. That's what I think. But it's painful. That one's real. Even Peni and I, we work together on contracts. We share contracts. We have to talk. He lives in Fiji. He doesn't have kids. I live in Australia. I'm a single mother with kids. We're going to get paid different amounts. So we have to have these really difficult conversations between the two of us. Actually, some of the hardest conversations I think we've had about how we're going to ask to be paid. In little microcosm. It's really, really difficult. Yeah. That one was first.
Tenakoto, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to go over this so you can hear me. Ko-Angela Tukulima, my name is Angela Wilton, and I myself have been very guilty of holding contracts where I'm paid far more than local counterparts, having worked extensively in East Africa as an example. So I have full disclosure there as well. Two elements to my question, and I'll try and be brief, although that's not my forte. You mentioned, Yeshe, Robin DiAngelo as being your Bible, and I know that she has been, to some extent, heavily critiqued by bringing forth quite an American individualist approach to white fragility, so to speak, and that the focus is on the interpersonal and the individual, rather than focusing on the structural problems and what are those structural solutions. So I'm just wondering how you balance, and I'm not discrediting any of what you said because I think it's brilliant. How do you balance that kind of individual need for growth, particularly amongst the white folks, with addressing core structural issues that are much bigger than the individual? So that's just one element. I'm sorry, there's a second. The second element is how do you get past the bureaucratizing of partnerships? I do worry a little bit that to some extent we might be, again, leaning on Western tradition of let's write all this down and let's sign up and have a tick box and are you meeting that? As opposed to, I suppose, leaning further into, and I hate the term leaning into because we know that's problematic in the feminist world, but a more oral Talanoa tradition which doesn't dilute things down to an agreement, a piece of paper, that again feels like a very imposed approach. And again, not a critique, it's a how do you navigate those partnerships.
Thanks, Angela. I might take the first question and Yeshe can respond to the second. I think, particularly for this session, what we're really talking about is the role of the individual to try and make change happen, trying to make it more equitable partnerships happen. But I mean, we do recognize that the change also it doesn't absolve institutions and systems of the change. It also needs to happen. The paper that Yeshe and I co-authored with others really talks about not just changes individuals can make, but also organizations and also systems. So the development sector, what changes can be made there. What I can tell you is that there's a cohort of us development practitioners from around the Pacific who in different ways engage with donors, both MFAT and DFAT, to really try and shift the way the system thinks and works. Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is, for this session, we're really looking at the role of the individual partnership broker to try and shift the way partnerships work, but certainly that doesn't absolve institutions and systems of fundamentally racist ways of working. And then how can we begin to work, I guess, collectively or in coalitions to try and shift those? I was at the Australasian Aid Conference last week and had some productive and interesting discussions with those from DFAT and other development partners in Australia. But part of the work, I think, also involves Pacific Islanders having those open discussions with people from DFAT and MFAT and other development partners to say there is fundamental inequity in the system and we need to begin to shift them. I think often what happens is those are, as Yeshe said, simmering under the surface. We never really talk about it, but we really need to begin to have those conversations and begin to push the systems as well.
And on your first one, I've made at 47, along with my colleague here, I totally see that systemic work has to be done. Me personally, I find it deeply disempowering. So I've made a choice to work at individual and organisational level. There's plenty of people doing the work. I don't have to work everywhere. I feel completely overwhelmed and disempowered by looking at and operating at levels of systemic change, and I completely admire people who are doing it, but it's not for me. Also, we find it really interesting. When we did that conference in Australia, we gave people the choices. I only wanted to give people choices of going into organisational or individual discussion groups. Again, the big INGO CEOs insisted on offering the systemic option. What happened? What do you predict happened? 2/3 of the people went into the systemic group. It's much easier to sit around and complain about donors in the system than to do the individual work that you can do to make changes tomorrow at your desk with your black and brown or your white colleagues. So we both are empowered by doing that work and feel like it's an underserved space where people aren't having brave conversations. So I leave the systemic work to others with all admiration for doing it, I guess. And then the second... I guess on that one, what I'm trying to work on is as a third space, a space that's not white and not black, but a space where we have a way of operating in a cross-racial place that works for both sides. Sorry, this is all very binary, I know. I hope you've read our paper and seen all of our acknowledgements about reductive language. We desperately wrote all of that out. So for me, this partnership work is creating a space to have conversation, focused on conversation. And in every partnership that we work on, we say, we're going to write up a partnering agreement because it serves a purpose. The important thing is the conversation. And you need to repeat this conversation every 6 months. You can't do this at the start and never do it again. So I found it, we've had Pacific Islanders deeply emotional going through these partnership processes because they're saying, look, this is valuing our relationships and making space to build our relationships, at the same time satisfying the bureaucratic and institutional needs of donor partners. So we try and create a third space that, I don't necessarily, with this partnership work, I don't think like moving fully into Talanoa is the answer. I also think Talanoa is being appropriated by people who don't understand what Talanoa means. I myself experience Talanoa as a very masculine space that's very much dominated by male leadership. So I don't think it's always appropriate necessarily. And I've just been asking Peni a couple of nights ago, just explain Talanoa to me again, because I think white people are just using it as we have a conversation. That's not what Talanoa means. So I think what we try and do is create space for different conversations, place a huge emphasis on the relational, and then create documentation that satisfies other needs as well. But there's always a risk. The biggest risk, one of the biggest risks, is that once it gets codified into an organisation, this happened at the last organisation Peni worked at, people say it turns into a checklist. And they say, all right, no, we had that one-day workshop with Peni, and then we wrote the partnering agreement, and so now we've done the partnership thing, and we can just keep behaving the way we've always behaved. So that's there's a huge amount of advocacy involved with embracing this approach. You have to be constantly advocating and saying, this is not a one-day workshop and writing a partnering agreement. It's an approach that should inform every element of your collaborative work. Yeah. Is that okay? Oh, I think we're out of time.
It's great you put out the whole concept around race and racism. For the last 2 days, it's all good to hear about decolonisation and the effort. But we must acknowledge, and living Australia alone, we do have racism in New Zealand as well, right? We're sitting here, Open University, one of the universities that's talked about racism quite hugely over the last 3 years and lost many international students for that reason. Let's rewind and look at our own individual organizations here in New Zealand. A few months back, the Council of International Development asked me to present a workshop on racism in the international NGO sector. And I thought at that time, shit, because I'm brown and because I probably know racism, I'm asked to present about that. And for the 40 minutes I presented, it was pin drop silence and only one question after that. And we had a room full of all NGOs and other people from Africa. So in development practice, I think it's really important to look at your own organizations and look at the color within your organization. You cannot preach decolonisation. You cannot preach anything around partnerships or inclusive behavior and diversity and everything else if your organization is really right. And that is the same reality. It doesn't matter how long your partnership is. It doesn't matter how much programming you do. You will achieve next to nothing, or you will just be ticking boxes because you haven't really hired the right people in the job. In the programs that I've worked at in the Pacific, countries like Samoa have excelled hugely because of the right people who were employed at New Zealand level, to the program manager, and to the people who were included at Rice level. So it happens from the top, and if you don't change the color of your organization, I think we shouldn't expect anything better. Now, sitting with my Pacific colleagues and sisters here, I keep saying to them, imagine if we all sat there, right? And you pitch the question on us, what does decolonisation look like, mean like, and whatever next? We would have a ton load of things to tell you how it feels. Not only on the receiving end, but also sitting here today in New Zealand and doing development in the Pacific. A lot of us, well, there's not many of us, women of colour, in the development space in New Zealand. And the hardest and the shittest thing to do is to be in this space and carry the burden of teaching people, our people here, but also people back at home, what colonization harm really means. So in the sense, we've been fatigued. We run away. We go, shit, this is too hard. We do all the daily work for the High Commissioners, this, that, whatever. So it is difficult. And when you do employ someone who's of color, just make sure you look after them, because the fatigue really sets in. If you think your fatigue is 100%, I was change behavior, and thank you so much to you all, because we have been sitting and saying, oh my God, more actions on decolonisation, more efforts, but we can't change if we don't change here, in-house, within our own organizations, and that's where the change starts. I've seen large programs go to countries like Fiji, run by a party owner sitting beside who has got no idea of that country. Absolutely none. But because the person holds professional manner, he or she is the program manager. So we have to rethink how we do things here before we go and dictate to the other people in the Pacific how to do it better.
Can I, thank you, it's fantastic. I just want to sound one note that, it's not a note of alarm, but I worry about, in a way, saying that there has to be brown people in the room for the work to be done lets us off the hook. Like, absolutely, diversity inclusion is the first thing that needs to happen, 100%. But a room full of white people should be able to do this work. We do not need a brown person to perform their pain for us to understand what our racial grouping has done. So I just want to say, even if there's no brown people in the room, even if the organisation is completely white, we should still be able to do this work. You guys shouldn't have to carry the burden of doing this work. So yes, diversity inclusion, absolutely, change the boards, change the staff profile, but if that's not always possible, that doesn't mean we don't do the work. Yeah. Just think I worry that the diversity and inclusion agenda becomes another thing where people say, oh, we've got 3 brown women on our board now, and they still don't do the personal individual work. Yeah. Or we can't do that work. Like I've had conversations where someone says, we can't even have this conversation until there's a person of colour in the room. Like, yes, we can. Every one of us who's sat in a room in the Pacific and seen white people talk for 80% of the time knows what the problem is. We just have to work out ourselves how to do better. Yeah. Is that okay?
Depends on the context.
Yeah, it depends on the context. First stop is always diversity and inclusion, but in some ways it lets us off the hook. The diversity and inclusion, it's another pacifier in a way. It can be.
It is, but you've got to think, if you have not walked into the shoes of being the recipient on the other end, then your expectations are almost different. You know, and for a lot of us, we have been on the recipient side, and now on the donor side. And what does that shift look like? And,
You've made the shift.
Empathy in it is quite different, depending on the context. And we have seen that in New Zealand, a lot of work moves, not disregarding the knowledge and the expertise that comes with other people. When you go to countries like Vanuatu, you've got one Kiwi guy sitting there doing planning for whole of Africa, you know, and nothing's moving. And yet people say, yeah, no, but he's the one who's doing it. And yet all the Nivan people floating around and going, no, but he's been the one who's been given by the donor agency, they want him to. Yeah. And then effectively what happens in countries like that, a lot of funding is returned to the donor because nothing moves. Now if you had a Nivan person, and this is capability building long term, trained in that place, doing the work that they should be doing because they have got the insights into the country knowledge, things move faster.
I think we're going to, Penny, we'll run out. I think we're over already, aren't we?
No,
Oh, okay, sorry. Keep going.
Yeah, so it depends on the context, I suppose. As partners in development, we just have to be careful in how we build capability and capacity on the ground.
Do you want to say anything about the diversity and inclusion stuff?
I can just make a comment. It's also about not having a brown person to tick the box. It's what you can bring into the table and what you can contribute to, contribute to that development program that you're trying to run. And so, and I've spoken earlier on about if you have a qualified, indigenous person there, then that's fine. But if you do it, if that's not possible, then you can bring outsiders, but also working with your local stakeholders or partners to be able to engage in that space. I made a comment earlier on because sometimes it's just with the remnants of colonialism. People project perceptions of Papua New Guineans or other people. So that's why that was the comment I made. But having been in this space and with a lot, you might have your own experiences. It's not about every brown person to tick the box. It's about what you can bring and understanding in the context that you mentioned, where that can be contributed meaningfully, and it's just shared space. And I'm not trying to say the process of decolonization and acknowledging other partners and contributors and people in that space. A lot of development partners and practitioners who go in many cases, are people with good intentions to contribute. Maybe because of systematic ways where the institution or you've been contracted by, I don't know, some of the contracting companies that Australian government likes to pick up to do with you, whereas you are in that as a capacity, as a consultant, then they have their own means and ways of remunerating you or looking after you for the work that you do. But if you do have individuals or people within communities that have that knowledge, you have to go in with an open mind that they already knowledge in that community context. And I hate to say that some people claim to be experts in the area or in the communities that involve, and that's probably wrong. But not to discount other people that have experience. Some people have grown up in those communities or so. They might have some more clarity or in-depth knowledge of that community as well. So they can't. But I think it's just context and the way we see it. And I think there's supposed to be a balance around that, because sometimes, it can be too extreme, like you say, it can be a tick box and also not recognizing a local person who's capable and has got a lot more to contribute, and playing yourself as an expert and downplay the local expert. And so getting that balance right, I think, will work for all of us.
Thank you. We've got one here and then we'll go to you. This is a quick one. Hi, Nalini. It's Nalini Singh. She's saying, does the Partnership Brokers Association training cover other intersectional issues besides race? Or is it heavily focused on race? Probably Peni and I, within the whole association, are focusing most intensively on race, and other people within our association are learning from us. So it's not the Partnership Brokers, and there are other people in the room who are accredited with the Partnership Brokers Association too. The training should equip you to deal with all different kinds of power dynamics within whatever partnership environment you find yourself in. Sarah? Oh, yeah, go quick.
I was just going to put a call that if people are interested in becoming familiar with some of the tools and methodologies that Yeshe and Peni have shared more broadly around race, not just around race, a group of trainers in New Zealand are running a training session. It's a 3-day in-person, some online next March, I think at the end of March.
Yeah, so just for people online, the Partnership Brokers Association, there's great trainers here in New Zealand. Sarah McKenna's part of the group that's focusing on this, so you can access the training and other training opportunities here in New Zealand, which is great.
Yeah, thanks for this. My name's Chanel, so I work with Conservation International, so more environment type work. But you can't work within the environment without doing development work. And so I've been working in the region for 15 years or so. And this is really good. This is my first development conference, meeting regional partners.
Welcome and congratulations.
Oh, no, that's great. But this also, look, this is a good example too of why Talanoa is so important, because you can't put limits on a session where you need to dive into things, and it's like a little cheap teaser.
Yeah.
And everyone goes out and have the coffee and stuff like that, So
It's
that's
frustrating.
the power of Talanoa. I'm not putting time limits on things, because you need discussion to go, but obviously we live in a Western constraint, so we've got to otherwise we'll be here till 9 o'clock. So my question really is around you know, we were just talking about change starts within. Do you guys do trainings that are within organisations for cross-divisional partnerships? So we've got leadership teams and field teams and development teams. And, you know, say if you look at any big organisation, Caritas, Oxfam, CI, WWF, you know, very different divisions. So you can't paint the organisation with one brush and say, oh, they're like that. Because each division works very differently, but then sometimes their relationships with other parts of the org could be better to help with that internal change. So I'm wondering if you guys have experience with that and having these types of workshops.
Sorry, I'm talking more than Penny, which is making me uncomfortable, but I do the training. Partnership Brokers Association does all kinds of work like that. We work with organisations on their partnering model, so assessing the approach and the way they're working, and working with different parts of the organisation. One of the things I really insist on when I'm doing work is I want corporate services people in the room as well as programmatic people, for example, because you can get a fantastic programmatic relationship and then your finance manager comes in behind and enforces power over and undoes all of the work that you've just done. Yeah. And when I'm negotiating partnership agreements in the Pacific, I can't insist, but I desperately encourage that boards and leadership are also part of those partnership negotiations. So the answer is yes. Yeah. If your finance and contracts managers aren't on board, then all you're doing is creating unreasonable expectations and huge disappointment. Yeah. I think, do you want to?
There's a last question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hopefully for Penny.
We've been raising our hands.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Respecting the line, but anyway, let's ask specific islanders. I'll let him ask a question first.
For your presentation, I was looking at your questions, your 5 bullet points, and so I've been reflecting with those to reframe how we think about partnerships in the context of how we define family. Family appears in the presentation, and I have huge respect for how we think of family, but how we define family from an Indigenous perspective or whānau, I think allows conversations with our family at work, our work colleagues, and also the community, and also as practitioners. So if I had to think of the hierarchy of what stands out in terms of being a good partner, it's informed deeply by how I think of whānau, because whānau will stay forever, and partnerships can be seen as process, practice, and tactics for how things can happen now, later, and maybe later on. But the context of whānau, I think there's an opportunity there to redefine it in the continuum of partnership. And I just wanted to also say, when we say, there's a question there about how do we go soft, I thought that was interesting, and it just reaffirms the context that you guys are speaking from in Australia. But definitely the questions here, I'm reflecting as a practitioner, is Indigenous, who lives in Aotearoa, and also is tuakana to Māori, and the connection between Pacific and Māori and non-Māori and Pākehā. We are on this whenua, and so I think there's power in deep diving into the concept of whānau to really look at partnership. And also lastly, as a Pacific practitioner, when I think of partnership, I think of protection, because I am the older sibling, tuakana to Māori. So I don't see myself as the other over there. I see myself as the cousin over here, taller, wiser, and therefore I can hold space and hold it till my fingers bleed perhaps, because it's also, that is the role of being a protector of the partnership to come. Yeah. So I'm just giving you guys just some reflections about being an Indigenous practitioner in Aotearoa, a donor country, and just let's broaden the concept of family to be whānau, because we are all whānau, but highly contextualised in work, humanitarian circles, but also in our communities. Thank you.
I really love your use of whānau, family, as a definition of partnership. And for me, I think this brings up one of the things I love to talk to Yeshe about is the Australia-Fiji partnership is called Vuvale, which is, far now. But I think using a word that's very loaded for us indigenous peoples for what is in some ways a transactional relationship can be quite problematic, because in the family you can push back, you can engage robustly. What we essentially have here is a donor saying, we are family, and this is what the bucket of funds it will give you, but you can't use it for those other things. So I mean, I really love it, and because I also know across the Pacific we consider ourselves family. In some ways, I think also in New Zealand, because you also have the Maori element to it, it also feels like family. When you have donors who use family to further their public diplomacy ends and national interests, I think that's problematic. Yeah, thank you.
Come to our next session. It's going to be entirely focused on personal racial reflection. We're going to break into racial groups to talk about that in racial groups, and then come back to have conversations across racial groups as well.